Yeah, Bernadette. Perfect. Okay, so we're now recording. So welcome and thanks for joining this session. My name is Janet Gilman and I'm the chair of this session. We'll be here for an hour talking about reflective mediation practice and conflict theory. So I know a number of you in the room, but I'm the state conciliator with the Oregon Employment Relations Board, where I serve as the program administrator and chief mediator for the state's conciliation service. And I'm honored to be joined by a couple of colleagues on this panel. First is Steve Irvin, who actually works with me now at the Oregon Employment Relations Board as a state mediator. Steve brings an advanced mediator's perspective to our subject matter today. And I'm also joined by Todd Dickey, assistant professor of public administration and international affairs at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. And Todd will offer insight from an academic perspective, drawing on his very thought-provoking research on workplace conflict. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about my idea for the session before we get started. It really grew out of some experiences in my own mediation work over the past couple of years. My mediation colleagues at Oregon Urban and I have evolved a system of reflective practice, which is based on the work of Allison Taylor and Michael Lang, and some mediators in the audience may be familiar with this book too, The Making of a Mediator. Reflective practice really serves as a vehicle for us to think critically about our mediation cases, both in preparing for and planning interventions for our cases, and also in debriefing them with one another as sort of a form of continuous improvement. And through engagement in this reflective practice, we've really developed a greater appreciation for the role that theory plays in shaping our perspectives and informing our decisions as mediators. And certainly theories of conflict have particular relevance to our practice. And so while this sort of reflective practice was emerging and developing, I was introduced to a theory of industrial conflict that was advanced by the late Hoyt Wheeler, who's actually a former LIRA president and a well-respected and well-known scholar and friend to many within LIRA. And his book, Industrial Conflict and Integrative Theory, which was written in 1985, came across my desk. And I found that the tenets of his theory, I found many of the tenets of his theory to be useful for better understanding some of the more complex and perhaps sometimes elusive dynamics at play in collective bargaining mediation in particular. So I thought it would be useful to have a LIRA session that brings practitioners and scholars together to talk about the relationship between practice and theory, and to structure the session in a way that provided some tangible takeaways for mediators, while also maybe simulating some additional lines of inquiry for academics if they're in the audience as well. So the following slide provides just a roadmap for our next hour. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and we are committed to leaving some time at the end for your questions and discussion. But we've got Steve, who's going to kick us off with an overview of the reflective practice model advanced by Lang and Taylor, and that we've adapted to our use at URB. And then Todd and I will each introduce some elements of conflict theory. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Wheeler theory, and Todd's going to bring in some of his own conflict concepts. And then we're going to turn back to reflective practice with some specific examples of questions mediators might ask when developing their case formulations. And Steve's going to apply some of those questions to an actual mediation to illustrate the reflective aspect of the model. And then we'll end with some formulation questions drawn from conflict theory to show in practical terms the relationship of theory and practice. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve to get us started.
All right, thanks. Okay, so I found this Lang and Taylor to be very instructive for me, because I came into this from a journalism background 11 years ago, and I found early in my practice I did a lot of trial and error, and I think there was more error than trial. So this allowed me to kind of ground myself a little bit better. And Lang and Taylor, they identified 4 stages of professional development. There's the novice, the apprentice, the practitioner, and the artist. And wrote that the ability and the discipline to integrate reflective practice into one's work is a key to advancing through those stages. And it's not a linear progression. You go and occasionally you'll run into some artistry, and then you'll step back, and it's not a linear process necessarily. But part of the reflective practice is understanding what makes up our constellation of theories, which is at the top left of this slide. Lang and Taylor's model says the constellation of theories is the, quote, the sum of all the mediator knows. And they ask a series of questions in the areas that are detailed at the top left that help bring that constellation to light. For example, core belief, one of the questions they ask are, what are my beliefs about justice and fairness? The theories that unify and explain abstract concepts. A question that they have asked in there is, what's my view about how conflict emerges and is dealt with? In the models of mediation and negotiation, a question they ask is, when I'm working as a mediator, I must blank, or when I'm working as a mediator, I cannot blank. And as far as facts go, what standards of practice do I follow? Moving clockwise on the slide, reflective practice requires that we ask ourselves questions that lead to a mediation formulation. It's a conceptualization of a case that's created early in the mediation, evolves through the process as mediators gain more information, observe the interactions of the parties, and note how they respond to the mediator's interventions. And the formulation includes 3 major parts, which would be the characteristics of the dispute, the characteristics of the disputants, and the methodology for mediation. While the mediation formulation helps bring clarity to the dispute at hand, as we continue on clockwise, pre and post session inventory questions are designed for the mediators to reflect on our role in the process, and they can help mediators pay attention to critical moments that may arise in the mediation. The pre-session inventory builds on that mediation formulation, as you see in the bullet. Draws on your past experiences and with similar disputes, because we've all run, if we've been doing this for a while, we've run into a lot of disputes. And a lot of times when you're doing your pre-session inventory, it's like, oh, this looks a lot like something I've seen before, and here are some of the things that might arise out of that, or things that I experienced before. And it focuses your attention on the potential approaches and techniques. It's in my own cases, I found that I have a pretty good memory for holes and pitfalls that have arisen along the way that I want to try to avoid. So that with the pre-session inventory is one of the uses of that, is to try to move into using that experience as a framework for what you're about to step into. Finally, the post-session inventory, helped mediator review the critical points that did arise during the meeting, and they're used to examine your thoughts and actions, highlight the patterns of parties of behavior and how you responded to it. And that's, I think, a lot of times when we reflect on our mediations, or at least in my case, I reflect on the parties' behavior, and this has the post-session inventory ties their behavior and my interventions and responses to that. And it also points out how the effect of those interventions on the process. It's like, there's my 5 minutes. Great. I knew I set a timer for a reason. So that's kind of a brief overview. For the next portion of the presentation, we're going to turn it over to Janet to take a look at the constellation of theories quadrant and a couple of conflict theories as examples of theory that may help inform the mediator's formulation.
Great, thanks, Steve. So you can see in that constellation of theories area, there's a lot going on there. And so we develop our theories based on experience and a lot of things. We're going to just try and introduce some scholarly theory as another hook to hang your coat on, if you will, or a framework for thinking about mediation. And we're just going to sort of quickly go through a couple of those as an example. So think about, consider for the moment the practice of collective bargaining mediation. Collective bargaining and mediation typically happen within a legal framework. So the mediator enters the dispute at some point in the bargaining process and centers their attention on the negotiators and the outstanding bargaining issues. However, those of us who work in the field know that that's not the only level at which the conflict may be present. Collective bargaining is happening in the context of a larger social system where there's potential for conflict in the form of collective action that may have a significant impact on what is happening at the bargaining table and vice versa. So this slide is intended to sort of illustrate the complex environment that labor mediators walk into when they're mediating collective bargaining cases. There are complex dynamics to navigate at the table. Table talks are influenced by external dynamics that are often removed from the mediator's direct line of sight, and they're even more removed in this virtual environment when we're not even on site. But if we fail to track what's happening at that level, what's developing at that level, there can be missteps and missed opportunities and the potential for a lot of frustration in the mediation process. So enter stage left Hoyt-Wheeler's theory of industrial conflict. This is a theory that was developed in the mid-'80s. As I said, it attempts to explain and predict the development of industrial conflict. So this sort of stage that we're operating within. And Hoyt himself said that a theory of industrial conflict has small claim on our attention unless it can produce improved understanding or prediction of industrial conflict. So in a sense, it's really, sometimes theory can be a mediator's best friend because it can help us explain to ourselves and maybe to the parties what's happening. And it can also help us anticipate, if not predict what's happening, but have some sense of what is the flow that we're involved in. Again, it's not going to answer every question, but it can give us a framework. So we introduced this theory today, not to critically examine it. We don't have time for that. It would be maybe an interesting session for another time, but rather to use it as an example of a theory that may help us to create a set of questions that might allow us to more effectively gauge and more effectively respond to the conflicts that we're called to assist in as mediators. So Wheeler's theory basically posits a set of factors that give rise to industrial conflict. He also identifies factors that are likely to curb its development. But let's get clear as to what is Wheeler talking about when he says industrial conflict. He defines it as collective aggressive action by employees. So there's a lot of loaded words here, but just bear with me because actually he does a really nice job in the book sort of unpacking and trying to explain all these words. But collective aggressive action by employees in opposition to their employers. So he includes organizing for the purposes of collective bargaining, striking to resolve an impasse in collective bargaining, or other generally more spontaneous collective actions, wildcat strikes, work to rule, slowdowns, even filing a number of grievances, sick outs, that kind of thing. And Wheeler is careful to say that the adoption of this definition should not be taken to imply that it's only the action of employees and not those of management which produce industrial conflict. Managerial actions are important causes of industrial conflict as well. This definition just simply focuses on employee action as the primary subject in his model. So in a nutshell, how do you go from a small group of frustrated employees to hundreds of employees walking off the job? Wheeler's theory attempts to explain how this can happen, and I'm going to summarize it in one PowerPoint slide. So you're getting the seriously condensed version of this, but I hope that it will help enough to provide a framework for our discussion today and maybe pique your interest a bit about this so you might pick up Wheeler's book yourself. I mean, we know that as mediators, not every case we walk into ends up in a strike or fully developed industrial conflict, but maybe many of us can recall times when that did happen and we felt maybe a little out of it or disconnected or surprised by what was happening. And so this is really just designed to help us maybe see some things in our environment, ask some questions about the environment that will help clue us in. So Wheeler asserts that where there is a gap between, so we start at the level of individual readiness, right? So individual employees getting involved. So Wheeler asserts that there's a gap, when there is a gap between an employee expectation and achievement related to material outcomes like compensation or social dominance. I'm going to call these issues related to control or voice. He uses that term and spends a lot of time, again, unpacking and defining these terms, but let's just call them issues of control or voice. The employee is likely to take non-aggressive action to obtain what they feel they are justly entitled to. So an example of a non-aggressive action to try and attain what you feel you're justly entitled to is collective bargaining. But bargaining, of course, creates the potential for frustration and may place that employee on a path toward readiness for collective action. Wheeler posits that another path is made operative when a threat is posed or actual harm is done by the employer to an employee's expected level of outcomes. So for example, if there are wage cuts or proposed takeaways in bargaining, these can be seen as threats or things that are going to actually harm the employee in achieving its desired outcomes. And another path that's activated is a cost-benefit ratio. Again, super simplifying this, but that the employee sort of determines that the benefits of the action will outweigh the costs. And again, this is for mediators, this is all a little bit, yeah, we know this, we think this. This idea, I think, is really trying to surface some of these things and give us a place to maybe think about asking questions and just give us some sort of framework for monitoring our environment. So Wheeler also asserts that there are a number of factors that will lead to the discontinuance of the pursuit of a collective action. Mediation is one of those things, right? If things get satisfied, it's not going to progress, but there could be fear. He names fear of consequences, failure to identify the frustration with the employer, and or the employee has an exit strategy. So these are a number of things that could sort of stop this web of collectivity from weaving together and gaining strength. We'll talk about those a bit later in the session and also talk about how those, factors get thought about or used potentially by the mediator to influence, a positive outcome in the negotiation. So once readiness for collective action against the employer is achieved by some workers, the probability of industrial conflict through collective action is high, according to Wheeler, when a few things are going on. Again, a little bit no-brainer, a substantial proportion of the members are feeling it and are ready. And he also talks about certain inhibiting factors would be absent and certain special hothouse facilitating factors are present. So let's just look at those. Again, the inhibiting factors would be fear of consequences, or perhaps this collective action would violate strongly held norms or beliefs with the group. And these hothouse factors, again, just going to summarize these. We're going to go into more detail about what these mean. But Wheeler argues that, the stronger positive effects among group members, the higher the likelihood this is going to sort of convert into a collective action. The employees have some hope of success. And again, this can be sort of gauged and measured by a number of things in the environment, and that there's some saliency of collective action as an avenue for this success. So this is a very dense model. There's a lot going on. Wheeler acknowledges it's complex. You might wonder as a mediator, how much of this, is important for a mediator to be tracking. I would argue that I think in certain cases it's very important because there's a direct relationship to what's going on in the negotiating room and vice versa. and that there are things that we can do. There are questions we can ask. And I think particularly in this virtual environment, we may have to adjust how we make these assessments because we're not actually walking down the hallways. So now I'll turn it over to Todd for a slightly different way of looking at and defining conflict. We're going to come back to Wheeler, but now we'll get another look through Todd's topology of conceptual logics of conflict.
Thank you so much, Janet. And it's been so fun working with you and Steve on this. Our conversations have been really enlightening, and I was very honored to be invited to jump in and chime in because, as I've told Janet and Steve many times, I have this current project I'm working on logics of conflict that was set up specifically to be like a full, like kind of academically oriented, kind of talking to different academic disciplines. And I kind of I kind of made this pledge, well, I'm not going to, you can't do everything in one paper, right? And so kind of that connection to practice, connection to the practice of conflict resolution, I wasn't trying to do. But when this opportunity came up, I was like, okay, I think this is a sign that I should try. And it's been really great because I feel like, I've been really able to think about it in new ways and make connections and different things. So yeah, this has just been a lot of fun. So thanks again. As you'll see, this is, I guess, a PowerPoint fail. We tested it. Work. I promise you it looks better on my computer. We'll blame Zoom. This is just a typology that I'm working on in a paper right now that is comparing norms and what I'm calling logics of conflict in the academic fields of industrial relations, which is kind of the home turf of LIRA. And then compared to the kind of business school equivalents, what we call organizational behavior. So again, looking at it from a more disciplinary lens rather than a practice lens. And it's been really fascinating. We're going to talk more after Steve kind of shows us some reflective practice pieces. But I'm kind of taking, a level up, kind of the what is conflict that Lang and Taylor, I would argue, probably don't really get into. There's obviously a lot of assumptions sometimes that we know what conflict is, and we're all talking about the same thing. But one of the findings of this research and paper is that we're actually often talking about very different things across academic disciplines. And that's one of the reasons why kind of calls to collaborate across academic disciplines, they've been continuous over the years, but they often seem to fall flat. And one of the reasons I argue in this work is that we're actually talking about different things. And that's what I'm going to go into now a bit. And as I've told Janet, when we were talking about Hoyt-Wheeler, it's been really fun because Hoyt-Wheeler, this theory came out in the 1980s, and then it's kind of sat by itself, kind of on the bookshelf a little bit, and isn't really integrated into a lot of current research in industrial relations, conflict resolution, and conflict theory. So just kind of bringing it back off the shelf, I think it has a lot to offer the conversation. But then as I was thinking through this logics chart, which I'll explain now, I realized, oh, there's actually a lot that can be kind of still added here. So just to go over real quick these two dimensions, and then I'm going to talk a little bit later about how they can be applied. We have two dimensions that I'm working with. Kind of the form of conflict is the first one, where I've identified two kind of forms that conflict can take, either a spatial form or a temporal form. And the spatial form is, again, I'm happy to answer questions about it. I kind of went back to some classic industrial relations scholars. One is Neil Chamberlain, active in the 1930s and 40s. He was one of the founders of the precursor to LIRA. And he talks about conflict being the area that is not embodied by a collective bargaining agreement. And I'm paraphrasing him right now. So he really thought of it as the space, and as soon as the collective bargaining agreement is reached in the unionized context, we have an area of cooperation. So therefore it can't be conflict. Temporal is kind of the opposite, in which we see conflict being seen as a process, being seen as starting when individuals see a difference or an opposition, but it's much more on the parties or the mediator kind of seeing something start and finish, right? And so again, I argue that that is more of a norm in the business world, organization behavior fields in academics. So it's not as spatially defined. And again, we hopefully will have a lot of time to talk more in depth about this. But just to introduce the second dimension, in the last few minutes in this part, I probably could have a better, kind of more clear phrasing, but I call it the determining agent of the existence of conflict. But really what it is does the observer, so does the researcher or the mediator determine whether there's conflict, or do the parties? And that is a real distinction. Sometimes we just take it for granted, again, that conflict is just kind of, ever present, or we know when we see it, right? But often we see there are different views that parties will have versus a mediator or a researcher. So traditions in the industrial relations field would give a little more, I argue, would privilege the researcher or the mediator a little more. And then research traditions in the organization behavior field are going to privilege the parties more in terms of whether conflict exists. And so if you go back to Chamberlain, he doesn't need to ask the parties. If he goes into a workplace and sees a collective bargaining agreement, he doesn't need to ask the parties, do you feel that there's conflict in this workplace? Because he can just look at the collective bargaining agreement and see, based on his definition, okay, well, whatever you've agreed to in this agreement is labeled cooperation. So, and then in the when we see a lot of research on team conflict, we see relationship conflict, task conflict, a lot of that research coming out of organizational behavior, we often see those scales that measure those conflicts is very party determined. So it's based on survey data that would have a party say, how are you feeling right now? Or there's all of these kind of psychometrics on that. So it's just a very different way of determining whether there's conflict. And it's something that we often just don't talk about because of these norms. And so really interested to kind of think about how that applies to the mediation context, and particularly the labor mediation context. And we'll get to talk about that in a bit. So with that, I'm going to take us to turn it over to Steve, who's actually going to give us some real life application of Lang and Taylor, and then we'll be able later to kind of look at it from a Wheeler lens and then a lens from my theory as well. So take it away, Steve.
All right, thanks, Todd. So, as was stated earlier, mediation formulation for Lang and Taylor is basically conceptualization of the dispute. And for me, that process normally starts with the pre-mediation interviews and a review of the parties' pre-mediation proposals. And we're going to take a look at some of the questions. There are a number of questions that they ask in deriving and in creating a mediation formulation, but we'll take a look at a few of them here that I find helpful. Basically, what types of conflict are involved in this dispute? In the recent case that I had, there was definitely a relationship, or we'll take a look at specifically. I'm drawing upon some experiences that I've had in Oregon and in Washington that have led to work stoppages. So I'm going to try to walk through kind of conceptualization of formulation and things like that that occurred during those cases. So in the case that I'm discussing right now, the parties had relationship issues. They had a long-standing disputes that were culminating in this contract negotiation. They had data issues where they were not exchanging data. There were, obviously the interests were also a piece where they were apart. The presenting conflict in this case was, which would be the second bullet on the second major, yeah, there you go. What is the presenting conflict? Are there underlying conflicts? The presenting conflict was they were working on a successor agreement. The underlying conflicts in this case were perceived lack of respect or understanding for either party to really understand what's going on. They didn't feel heard. And then the third, what were some of the external power dynamics that the disputants face? And in the case I was talking about, the dynamics were, the individuals in the bargaining unit had become more frustrated as the year has gone along, and their collective power was starting to build as more of them became frustrated, and basically the marching orders for the bargaining unit was to make what they were experiencing go away. So then we move on to the characteristics of the dispute. The question would be, are the disputants in crisis as well as conflict? For example, in the COVID world, you have, there was a crisis. There was something that needed to be dealt with. COVID procedures needed to be dealt with. But there was a conflict in how that was done. So that was a good example of where crisis and conflict coexisted. The second bullet would be, a second question would be, what's their motivation in terms of the dispute and in terms of their participation? Other questions that we'd ask is, what's the range of flexibility with regard to exploring options for resolution? In the case that I'm talking about here, I felt like there was a lot of room for flexibility, but that was something I was disavowed of later as we went into the process, because keep in mind in these things that a mediation formulation is fluid. It changes during the mediation, or a series of mediations, as in this case, based on the new information you get, what you observe along the way while you're interacting with the parties. Another question would be, do they understand their own sources of power? In this case, the union did. They understood that they had the power to grind everything to a halt, and they wielded that eventually. And the outside forces, the last one, what outside forces are influencing the parties? You had the board on the administration side was wanting to hold the line on a lot of these things, and then you obviously had the outside influences of the bargaining unit that influenced what was going on here. So then we move on, so that gave me a formulation that, I was stepping into something that was potentially fraught, but I really, until I had more information, I really did not understand the depth of what was going on. So we moved into pre-session and post-session inventories, which I find to be the most valuable part of Lang and Taylor's work. They forced me to go beyond the mediation formulation, which is basically looking at the parties and examine the way I engage in the mediations. It's provided a good framework for me, like I said earlier, that I didn't have when I came to this work after working in newspapers for 25 years. So some of the pre-session questions that Lang and Taylor have include, what are the issues, sources of conflict, and the barriers and opportunities for resolution? How is this conflict similar to others, which has intervened, and how is it different? What's my formulation? How can I explain the conflict situation, the parties' responses to the conflict and to one another? And, that brought me to, another place where it's like I felt going in that I was prepared for what I was going to run into based on my formulation and these pre-session inventory questions. However, you in the series of information, you don't know what you don't know until you find out that you don't know it. And during the process of coming to an agreement here, I found out there was a lot of stuff I did not know. And for me, the post-session questions lead to the most growth as a mediator. basically, in looking at these questions, following the work stoppage in the case in question and that I was been discussing, I came to some of the following conclusions. And, my initial formulation, in what ways was my formulation transformed as I engaged with the client? I felt like in this case, the communication was the issue. I felt like that they were talking across each other, not to each other, not really hearing each other. And when I looked at this case in retrospect, I realized that that was off base. I learned along the way that, there were really deep wounds that couldn't just be healed in this process by talking it out. So, that was something, that it was maybe a partial blind spot where I was trying to do things that would help them communicate when they were so deeply entrenched in their dispute that it was hard for them to do so. So it was kind of working against me in a sense, and against coming to an agreement. The second question that I found really helpful in this case was my theoretical approach helpful in dealing with the parties in the conflict? And one of my constellation of theories is that conflict is best dealt with through open, honest communication that includes objective criteria. They weren't able to communicate in that manner, and they were unwilling to share objective criteria. So I think that my approach in this case was not helpful. And, it took me a session or two or three, or what seemed like forever, to realize that I had to adapt my approach accordingly. And, I felt in that case, that's where I went in that stages from artistry. Well, my hope was to get to artistry, but I felt like I was I felt almost like an apprentice in that sense, because what I was seeing in reality and what I was experiencing were two different things. So now I can take that knowledge into my next mediation and realize that, these are things that I blind spots that I have to think about. And then finally, were my predictions about the dispute and the needs of the disputants accurate? I would say, I think my prediction about their needs was accurate because they did need to communicate more effectively. However, my initial predictions kind of missed the depth of their dysfunction. And I think as a result, I misread and did not adequately assess their resolve to take collective action in this case. And, so I walked out of this mediation thinking to myself, what other questions could I have asked about the parties' conflict in the formulation or the pre-session inventory that could have given me a more accurate picture of what was going on? And in the next section of this presentation, Janet will show, some of the questions, how Wheeler's model could be used in a similar situation, maybe to gain more perspective that could have been useful to me and save me and the parties a little bit of stress. So take it away, Janet.
Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate, how you are thinking about this case and your willingness to just, be reflective in this environment. And it just, really reinforces for me the importance of not going into autopilot, if you will. I was just in the implicit bias session before this, and the idea of just the level 1 and level 2 thinking. I think in some ways we can do that as mediators as well, and with the issues of bias aside, although those become part of this too, is that to what extent are we in autopilot and just going along and not doing the deeper thinking and reflecting about our decisions, our actions, what we're experiencing, the assumptions we're making about cases. So I just really appreciate listening to you and how you use this tool to get to that deeper, more critical thinking and using it along the way. And again, even there, it's not going to guarantee that, that mistakes or missteps or things that we miss don't happen, but it reduces the likelihood of that. And then it builds sort of a library or an inventory for our next case. So yeah, taking Wheeler then, again, this is the lens that says what's going on in the outside, and is the outside influencing the table, and again, is the what's happening at the table, related to the external conflict. And that may even be a false dichotomy right there, this idea of table and external, they're all related. But let's just use Wheeler for a moment and imagine, are there questions that we can ask? And again, it's putting a question mark on some of his hypotheses and some of the assertions that he makes. But then the next question for mediators is it important that we access this information? And then how do we access it? And again, we're not going to give you the answers to that because it's case by case. And it's not always a direct question. So, but I think the first thing, I think this is interesting, to what extent is there a gap? Is there a gap between expectations and achievements? This is really more at the level of collective bargaining and at the table of mediation, connected to material outcomes or control or voice related issues. I mean, I think mediators maybe reflect on their cases, and some of the tougher cases that I'm involved in, those are usually the two things at play, right? That tension around control and voice, both on management side and on the union side, and then of course economic issues. And then, taking Steve's model of continuous assessment throughout the course, is the gap widening? Is it being reduced? And what am I basing that assessment on? How do I measure expectations and achievements? Again, we're not scientists going in there trying to, draw conclusions, where this is just information that's going to help us navigate as mediators. So something to consider. Is frustration mounting? Again, this is at the individual employee level. So maybe it's just you're looking at the teams. Is frustration mounting around a blocking of expected levels of achievement? Something like unsuccessful pursuit of grievances, that would be an example. If that's part of the narrative, if that's part of the story, that could certainly be seen as a blocking of expected levels of outcome, or wage reductions or attempts to reduce wages at the table. Those are going to be obvious blockers. So it just gives us a little bit, more in terms of understanding the character of the dispute, and maybe putting these employees on a path. Do the employees identify the employer with their frustration or some other source? This is interesting because, you can have a dispute, but depending on whose fault you think it is, could definitely mitigate, or impact the way the employees are looking at it. In the public sector in particular, if there's a sense that it's the legislature, or it's based on the economy, or it's about the tax structure, it's not really about the person they hired 6 months ago who was hired to come in to do all of this to us. Those are two very different takes on what is the source. And of course, Wheeler would tell us that if the employees are identifying the employer with their frustration, you're on a path potentially. And if that's the narrative, you're on a path potentially where some collective action could begin to mount. Have there been attacks or threats of attacks on the expected level of outcomes? We've talked about wage cuts, negative contract takebacks at the table. Those things are going to be, affecting the development of collective action. So individuals' readiness, taking collective form. Are we tracking that as mediators? And how do we track that? The sort of obvious, yes, a substantial proportion of the bargaining unit is ready for action. How do we know that? One of the things that we found in this virtual environment is that the typical signs that we look for, the rallies, the people gathering, how many people are coming into to assist the bargaining teams, the signs that are up, all of that in the field that we're used to, I think maybe even unconsciously, just sort of tracking the buildup, that gut feeling that you have that a buildup is happening. We're really disconnected from that. So again, are you going to go to the media? Or what kinds of conversations are you having with people? I don't have the answer to that, but it's a question worth asking. How are we going to gauge this, particularly in this environment? Okay, here's a question. Are there norms or fears within this group that may militate against collective action? Again, what is the mediator going to base that on? These are not necessarily questions you're directly asking people. This is, we've got our sort of our antennae up, our feelers out, we're making assessments. Are the hothouse facilitating factors present? So, Wheeler would say that, again, this is an interesting conversation. It would be interesting for a conversation and debate potentially, but he would argue that a large degree of homogeneity, shared demographics, supportive relationships outside of work, community ties, shared outside associations, those are things that are going to potentially create an environment where these positive, effective relationships or sense of common community may come together more readily. This is that hope dynamic. That's one of the hothouse factors, that there's a shared sense of hope. Wheeler talks about substantial outside resources, brought in and mobilized to support the action, could definitely give fuel to that hope factor. And so it's a question the mediator could potentially ask, or the mediator could be looking for. And again, I think we're doing this all the time on some sort of less conscious level. But this is, these are questions, these are assessment questions that we can ask to try and understand the environment. And then lastly, is there a presence of some saliency? That's that last hothouse factor. And, Wheeler says that even the presence of a dramatic leader could be a sort of some saliency, or that there was some mobilizing event. So arbitrary conduct on the part of the employer, for example, could be things in the environment that would give us some information to say, hey, I think this might be one where things could be rolling, right? I don't want to be caught off guard. I don't want to make judgments about it either, but I don't want to be caught in that situation where I didn't see this one coming. And in my mind, in the virtual versus the in person, if we end up going back to some hybrid, there may be some cases where, as you're seeing some of these early signs, you may want to get in the car or get on a plane and actually have some field sessions, if that's even possible, just as a strategy for staying more closely involved in what might be developing in this external environment around industrial conflict. So my last part of this is, I guess, for the mediators, a set of questions, what's observable and identifiable? Again, getting out of that gut sense, getting out of that, because mediators say that all the time. Well, my gut is telling me. I ask the mediators what's going on, and they say, well, this is kind of my sense. But what's observable? What's identifiable? What am I basing my formulation on? What other questions can you ask to learn about the situation using this model? And then how can you test or further develop your formulation? Because these are not all the questions. And then, of course, your own experiences are going to play a role in shaping questions and answers as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Todd. And he's going to get us thinking about conflict from his lens and some questions that can be applied as well.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Janet. And yeah, I think that it does tee up really nicely that kind of what I'm basing the formulation on, that question. And, going back to Lang and Taylor, and, we can talk about this in Q&A too. It's, one of the I think the conversation pieces, as I've said, my paper wasn't designed to be in conversation with Lang and Taylor and reflective practice, but now that it is, and also Wheeler, when we talk about, I think Steve was talking about, one of their questions is the accuracy of, was my formulation accurate? Well, I think that my work here, and hopefully, what we can continue to talk about, is that there's not one right accurate. That's conflict is sitting out there waiting to be found. It's how we conceptualize it, right? And so that is a really big change. And I think that some of the work around formulation, we can be then talking about, well, do the parties see it the same way I do, but not necessarily like, am I right? And so the questions that I have come up with kind of get us to the kind of thinking along that path, but I'll be eager to hear if there's kind of better ways to think about this. These are questions I put up here on that first dimension I talked about, the spatial versus the temporal form of conflict. And one thing I didn't put up here, but is a way, because we are framing this in the context of labor mediation, to kind of tease out the differences between spatial and temporal, because I bet we've all heard these kind of, I don't know, rules of thumb or phrases before. But how many times have you heard, the kind of people refer to the collective bargaining agreement as a temporary detente, kind of the Band-Aid on hostilities, but it's only temporary, right? Until that contract expires again, the collective bargaining agreement. I would posit that that's a spatial formulation of conflict, because we also sometimes hear the resolution, that reaching the collective bargaining agreement is this kind of seen as a full resolution of conflict. It ended the conflict, which is a strike, or that's kind of more along Wheeler's model, where it's a conflict is seen temporally, and it has a beginning point and an end point. And so the collective bargaining agreement kind of seals the end point. And so that would be a more temporal. That second point, do you think the terms conflict and dispute are interchangeable? I think that's a really good way to think about some of this. And I can tell you, even within industrial relations, within theorists who are kind of coming at it from a spatial lens, they will often, academic theorists, they will kind of interchange conflict and dispute all the time, which makes, I think that's what makes it harder to tease these theoretical nuances out. And so I don't want you to freak out every time you say the word dispute or conflict and then you're like questioning yourself, but it's something to think about. How does that kind of play in here? If you want to go to the next column, Janet, I will kind of introduce the other just question to think about, the other dimension to the logics of conflict, around the determining agent of the existence of conflict. Do you prioritize your answers to the previous two questions, or do you prioritize the party's answers? And obviously you could equalize them. I think that that's probably a good thing. But we may often find ourselves leaning towards, well, I know when I see conflict, or I just leave it up to the parties and they know when they see conflict. So we may just in our own practices and experiences kind of go one way or another. And another just dichotomy specifically from a labor context for this second column here is the notion of the contract zone for collective bargaining. So when we talk about there being a contract zone, a zone in which, classic bargaining theory, negotiation theory, in which if the parties get to that mythical contract zone, they will reach an agreement. That would be, again, a spatial, but also mediator determined, because, you as a mediator can figure out where that contract zone is, kind of hearkening back to the Neil Chamberlain. But then there's more of an emphasis on a party determination in the collective bargaining context would be kind of that notion of any settlement is a good settlement. I, as a mediator, it doesn't matter what I think. If the parties reach a settlement, even if I have that, you know, in the back of my head, but the party's reached it. So that would be more of that party determination leading the show. So again, I knew that this is really quick. I'm a big fan of the 90-minute sessions instead of the 60. So, but this is the hand we're dealt. The nice thing, I was just looking at the calendar, that there's not a session directly after this in this room. So we won't be kicked out exactly at 2:45. But with that, we do want to open it up. And if you're like me, if you want to just raise your hand using the Zoom function, I also will do this sometimes. But yeah, we would love to open it up whatever way you'd like to contribute. And again, questions, comments. I know there's a lot of expertise in the room, and we're eager to hear it. This is just our attempt to kind of combine different theoretical and practical engagement in the context of labor mediation, and happy to talk about other contexts as well. So thank you, and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, we do. We have about 5 minutes. So what are your thoughts out there? Are mediators in the room engaging in some form of reflective practice? And what do you think of the idea of this? Or any other thoughts or questions?
Hey, Janet, this is Javier.
Oh, hi, Javier.
I'll jump in on that. In all honesty, no. I want to do more of it. And granted, I haven't been meeting as much lately, but that's one of the things that we're putting together for newer mediators as they shadow, because shadowing is such a large component of their learning the mediation process. So that way they just don't shadow the mediator and then walk off and okay, that was fun. It was really truly to think about it, and also let the incumbent mediators know that you learn from this as well. When they're asking you questions, why did you do this? Why did you not do that? You have to think back and really analyze why it is that you did the steps that you did when you did them. And we see the benefit of this. So it was really nice to hear this and hear some structures that we could put to that. So thank you.
I appreciate that comment. And I think it's interesting, this has applicability and value for new mediators. And what we've also found is that, even advanced mediators kind of dealing with maybe a situation that doesn't come up all the time makes you end up feeling like a new mediator, a set of circumstances that sort of surprises you, so it can be pulled out. So I think we are tending to use this as not with every single case, maybe depending on point in career, but when those more difficult or challenging or head scratching situations come up, it's a tool that can be pulled out to help unpack what's going on. Yeah, Bob.
Sorry, I needed to unmute. I apologize for not being able to sit through the whole session. It sounded great, but I had some other obligation that I had to take care of. I wanted to ask this question about the last comment, actually. Any settlement is a good settlement. I actually, as a facilitative mediator in interest-based bargaining, I've had parties get to a settlement and want to start the party right then and there. And but caution and experience have taught me not to do that, and to have them sleep on it for 24 hours, get back together and work out the details, cross the T's, dot the I's. And in 2 instances, they found out that although they agreed, they were in one instance agreeing to different things and didn't realize it. And in another instance, they were agreeing to the same thing, but it was not doable from a dollars and cents standpoint. And so we had to go back and recreate it. I think there's a responsibility in a reflective sense on the mediator to put them through those paces and not just walk away and say, okay, they got an agreement. It's wonderful. And I think it's an ethical question more, so that it's incumbent upon the mediator, who supposedly has the experience, to guide them in that process. So
that's a great point, Bob. And it's just harkening me back. I did my PhD at Cornell, and I know for a lot of the labor mediators in the room, I also learned facilitative practice later, but my kind of classic training was, I would argue that that's not the norm in labor mediation. Of it's kind of like you lock those parties in a room and you don't leave until you get that signature, because that's what matters. And so it's almost putting the state, right? FMCS works for the United States, right? Janet and Steve work for the state of Oregon. That, I would argue that that potentially puts the state before the parties, because, the goal is to, not have a strike or a lockout. And that might come in conflict ethically with the goal, there. So that's the piece, because I would have, gotten a -10 points if I let the parties out in a labor mediation before signing that TA, right? So I don't know what my co-panelists think on that, state of Oregon employees, but but it's something to think about. I think that's a really good point. It's important to think about.
Okay, any other questions or comments last minute? Looks like we're about out of time, so we really appreciate your participation, your attendance, and let us know if you have ideas about this. We're happy to keep the conversation going, email or otherwise.
Great.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.